So this lecture continues to look at sort of the evolution of government in England, beginning first with a series of sort of baronial challenges to royal authority, which is going to continue that sort of move towards constitutional monarchy. And then under the reign of Edward I, sort of expansion outside of sort of England proper, and attempts of England then to establish its authority over some of the other sort of neighboring countries. So when John dies, it does create sort of a question in terms of the baronial revolt that's happened, culminating in Magna Carta. Number of barons are sort of happy to see John as sort of a one-off abuse of power, hoping that under his son Henry, sort of a little bit more baronial say in government will be restored. Others, though, continue to push against the monarchy. It's not that they have a problem with monarchy, they just want to replace Henry with Louis, the King of France's son, who they think they might be able to control a little bit more. So it's not the nature of government that they're challenging, it's just the way that government is actually functioning. And remember, the whole equation is the stronger the king, the weaker the barons, and vice versa. So they just want more authority and more of a role in government. So Henry first has to deal with ending this sort of first Barons' War. He is only 9, so it's not like he's actively governing yet. There is a regency council put in place, particularly leading members of the church who still very much support Henry and a strong English monarchy. There are a few small battles that are fought. It's William Marshall who sort of takes on Henry's cause himself, and eventually Louis, after a defeat or two, is sort of distracted by events back in France. Once he leaves, this baronial rebellion sort of collapses. And so people are then happy, or at least willing, to acknowledge Henry and his authority. He in turn then affirms most of the clauses of the Magna Carta. He also then, once his power is sort of restored, is able to send troops to France. Philip II has attempted to sort of challenge his control of Gascony and the Aquitaine, and so he's able to sort of reverse those losses there. The other thing that happens under Henry is, as you have this sort of commercial resurgence, urbanization, this new sort of group of people, so they're not peasants, they're not nobles, they're these merchants. Some of them become quite wealthy, and particularly these merchants in larger cities like London increasingly want a voice in government, and so Henry is able to sort of bring them in to some degree. However, as he continues to reach his age of majority, he then wants to establish his independence. He increasingly ignores the both councils, the Great Council and the Small Council, the counselors that he relied on, the barons he relied on early in his reign while he was still a minor, he increasingly sort of dispenses with and marginalizes, and sort of asserts himself. He has a number of half-brothers and sisters. So remember, Henry's mother was Isabel of Angoulême. She was married by John when she was quite young. She and John had 5 children, and you can see them here. Then after John died, she went back to France, and she married not the guy that she was engaged to before, but that guy's son. And so they continued to have 9 more children together. A number of those children then go to the royal court in England. They ingratiate themselves with Henry. He gives them a lot of land, a lot of titles, and a number of the other nobles in England become increasingly resentful of that. He also not only wants to consolidate his position in France, he actually engages in several different campaigns to extend his authority. At one point, he tries to crown his son King of Sicily, and that ends up being sort of a non-starter, but still very, very expensive. His wife, Eleanor of Provence, is also accused of a very extravagant lifestyle, and so all of this means that he needs money. And so increasingly then what happens is the barons say, you need to call the council like you agreed to under Magna Carta if you want permission to tax the English, and he ignores them until he absolutely cannot ignore them anymore. So because he is facing bankruptcy, he's forced to summon this sort of what we're now calling parliament, the composition of which is spelled out in the Magna Carta, the leading barons, the leading members of the church, now some burghers, to sort of come together. And what they say is, okay, we will give you permission to levy a tax, but first we want additional concessions. One of the biggest issues with Magna Carta is there was no mechanism for enforcement. So there was no way of holding the king to the promises that he signed. And so what they say is not just summoning us when you want money, but summoning us at least 3 times a year. And they want to establish a more sort of defined structure. So a council of 24, so the king can appoint 12 people, and then the nobles appoint 12 people. And then another council of 15. So this is this council will then appoint the chancellor, the justiciar, and the treasurer. So all of those sort of key positions in the government then are now chosen not by the king, but by sort of the nobility. And so we see Henry reluctantly agree to the provisions of Oxford, mostly because he's sort of backed against the wall and does not have any other options. And this then sort of quickly all falls apart. In 1259, he agrees to the Peace of Paris with the King of France, so he's able to to maintain control of the Aquitaine, but he renounces his claims to Normandy and Poitou and some of the regions in the north. Feeling emboldened by that sort of having settled affairs in France, he abolishes the provisions of Oxford. In 1263, then, he faces a second baronial revolt under the leadership of Simon de Montfort. So Simon de Montfort is the Earl of Leicester, but he also has lands in France. He is the Earl of Leicester because he's married to Henry's sister. And so Simon then sort of leads a number of these barons who really were invested in these ideas of this sort of limited government that the provisions of Oxford sort of dictated, but also increasing the sort of the voices of some of these leading nobles and members of the church in government. In 1265, then, there is a major battle at Luz. Henry, leading his forces, is defeated and he's imprisoned. He's forced once again to acknowledge the provisions of Oxford and also forced to accept this council in place. He's very marginalized by that council, and for all intents and purposes, government sort of is run by Simon de Montfort during this period. Henry's eldest son, Edward, who's in his mid-teens, he's maybe 16, 17, is also captured, and he's essentially sort of put under house arrest to force his compliance. This is a contemporary image of the Battle of Luz. This is, I think, one of the first times you really have a large-scale military conflict between various members of the English nobility. So the nobility itself is very much divided, and they're not pulling their punches. They're killing each other if they're a member of the opposition. Eventually, Edward is able to escape his confinement. He raises an army. He leads the king's army against Simon and the barons at the Battle of Evesham. Simon himself is killed. You can see this sort of depiction. He's killed and he's sort of horribly dismembered on the battlefield, sort of the ultimate sign of sort of retribution. Henry then is restored to power, and at the end of the day then, this sort of period of baronial government where you have the script flipped. It's really the barons who have more authority and the king is very much marginalized, does not succeed. There just isn't enough widespread support for it. There is still this sense in England that the king should have most of the power, that monarchy is still the government that they want, not an oligarchy. Though this claim by the nobles to have more of a say in government is not going to end. It's just sort of mitigated a bit. So eventually then, after Henry's death, he is succeeded by his son Edward. Edward is another very sort of glamorous figure in sort of English memory. He is very, very tall. He's over 6 feet tall. I think his sword is something like 6 feet from end to end. So that gives you an idea of how tall he must have been. And given a world of medieval height around 5'4", 5'5", he literally would have towered over other people. That's why he gets the nickname Longshanks. He also is known as the English Justinian, drawing on sort of Roman parallels. The Hammer of the Scots for his extensive campaigns against Scotland. And then there are some chroniclers that call him Edward the Great. So all of this is to say that he does leave a considerable mark on the history of England. And you can see from the dates he rules for a very long time, which offers an extensive opportunity for stability. So in part, the English Justinian references some of the legal reforms that he enacts. So in 1275, the first Statute of Westminster, I'm just hitting on the highlights of some of these. It's a long record of acts. This sort of tries to codify law. So you have a lot of different legal precedents that have sort of emerged over the ages. And what he tries to do is consolidate them so that you have sort of one body of law that then is sort of applicable everywhere. And this way you don't have differences, but you also don't have the potential for local abuses. Certain offenses are eligible for bail. So again, seeing the origins of some of our modern practices. So you don't have to stay in prison indefinitely. In the Middle Ages, if you're in prison, you have to pay for it. You have to arrange for your own food. You have to arrange for your own clothing. But this sort of allows certain people to be sort of not confined while they're awaiting trial. And he also establishes the jury system. So it's ideally a number of your peers who then are the ones who make the determination of guilt or innocence. He is very concerned about the alienation of land to the church because that means then any sort of feudal service associated with that land, so many knights you owe, is no longer necessarily owed. And also taxes then aren't necessarily paid. So he passes the Statute of Mortmain, which says that from now on, you cannot donate land to a monastery or a cathedral without first acquiring royal permission. Probably the most significant and most sort of sweeping of these legal changes is quo warranto, which is translated, the land's translated by what right. He actually sends out a requirement for all the vassals that hold lands in England to prove that they own that land. So how did they first acquire it? When did it first come into their family? Provide some sort of documentary proof that they have the right to own that land. And some people, this is easier than others, depending on how far back some of these acquisitions go. But it really is this attempt to sort of standardize land ownership amongst the nobility across England. And then in 1290, quia emptores, so if you do own a fief, you can't sell that fief to someone else, again, without the king's permission. So things are getting really messy as people sell off little parts of fiefs to other people. And then what happens is someone who's a lord has a vassal, and then that vassal becomes someone else's vassal. And instead of this sort of hierarchy of feudal service, you have almost sort of this spider web, and it's impossible to see sort of who owes what. And so this is an attempt to sort of continue to regulate this sort of hierarchy of feudal exactions so that the king can appropriately collect the amount of revenue that's due to him. Increasingly, the situation of the Jewish community in England has deteriorated. In 1275, the statute against Jewry is issued. Originally, Jews were very active in usury, so lending money and charging interest. Christians couldn't do it. But as the commercial revolution sort of continues to move forward, this type of buying and selling things on credit becomes standard. And once society realizes it's not going to go away, and it's also an incredibly lucrative source of revenue, then the Christian community says, okay, Christians should be allowed to do this. And so towards the end of the 12th and definitely into the 13th century, more Christians become active in sort of loaning money, charging interest in credit exchange. And so they're able to say, moving forward, that Jews cannot engage in that anymore. And that was such a source of income from them because they couldn't do anything else. So this becomes a real economic problem. He does say, okay, you can do some agricultural activity, but it's not sweeping enough, and it's such a sudden change that it doesn't really make up for what they've lost. A number of Jews continue to engage in usury, and you can see at one point he rounds up sort of 293 people who he identifies as offenders, and they're executed. In 1290, he actually decides to expel the Jews from England altogether. And this is not out of nowhere. It's sort of the culmination of a gradual deterioration of their position. A number of pogroms against Jews have happened. There was actually sort of a mob attack on the Jewish community in London on the day of Edward's coronation. And so he actually gives them sort of a 40 days, a month, to liquidate all their possessions and leave the country of England. And you can see this is a depiction of that sort of expulsion happening. So you can imagine how incredibly problematic this would have been for these members of the Jewish community. Most of them were not able to sell off all their property. They just had to leave it. They couldn't sort of collect all their debts. So it puts them in this extremely vulnerable position. But it also marks the beginning of steady deterioration of the Jewish position in Western Europe over the course of the end of the Middle Ages. So Edward then is most known for his military campaigns, particularly targeting Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as France. In particular, he succeeds where his predecessors had failed in, for the most part, subduing an independent Wales. So Wales had a number of princes throughout the Middle Ages. Every now and then, one would sort of claim authority over the others to varying degrees of success. In 1277, Edward attempted to subdue Llywelyn, who claimed that title, Prince of Wales. And Llywelyn's forces were forced to agree to the Treaty of Aberconwy, which very much sort of limited his powers. He didn't really intend to follow through on this, though. He just needed time to regroup his forces and to gain more allies. In 1282, he revolts. In response to this revolt against English authority, Edward sends in an army. Llywelyn is actually killed in the process, and there's no clear successor to sort of advance this cause of an independent Wales. By 1283, through just a lot of sort of devastation of the countryside, Edward was able to establish control of a lot of the northern part of Wales that had continued to sort of resist. You can see Dolwyddelan Castle here, which was sort of taken over in the 1220s. This was actually a stronghold of the princes of Wales, which then came under English control. In 1301, Edward has succeeded so much in conquering Wales that he has his youngest son crowned Prince of Wales at the Castle of Carnarvon. And this is why the heir to the throne of England today has that title, Prince of Wales. He then turns to Scotland with much less success. It's actually the Scottish who sort of invite him in and give him sort of a foothold to advance his claims to authority. The King of Scotland has died. He has a daughter, but then she dies, and so there's no clear successor in that family line. There are two clans that are claiming the right to rule, the Balliols and the Bruces. What the Scots agree to do then is to allow Edward to determine who actually should be the rightful King of Scotland. And so this is the great cause. In doing so, however, they acknowledge that he has this sort of higher authority over them, that he's then going to continue to sort of press moving forward as legitimation for some of his claims. In 1292, then, Edward determines that the person who has the most rightful claim is John Balliol. He's crowned. You can see that here. So this is Edward on the throne and Balliol submitting. And so this alliance is formed between Scotland and England. However, Edward acts in a very heavy-handed manner in a number of cases. He tries to force a lot of concessions from Balliol and really sort of demonstrate his subordinate position. In 1295, then, Balliol rebels. The following year, Edward is able to invade Scotland and force the abdication of Balliol. He really does reduce then Scotland to sort of a subject kingdom. He forces Balliol to hand over all the crown jewels. He actually seizes the stone of Scone, which is it's a stone, and it's sort of a symbol of the monarchy, and it's always brought out for coronations. Edward actually has this stone brought back to London, and he builds this huge throne, and he puts this stone at the center. So when he's sitting on the throne, he's actually sitting on the stone of Scone. However, the Scots do not agree to accept his authority. There's a revolt of Robert the Bruce in conjunction with William Wallace. William Wallace is a Scottish noble. He is not at all like he's depicted in Braveheart. He actually was the Scottish ambassador to France. He's very well educated. This is a statue of Wallace today in Stirling Castle to commemorate the victory of the Scots at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And this does buy them a fair amount of time and an attempt by Robert the Bruce to assert Scottish independence. However, eventually at the Battle of Falkirk, the position is reversed and Robert the Bruce is forced to agree to a truce. In 1305, Wallace, who's been sort of in exile since Falkirk, is captured. He's taken to London where he is executed. In 1306, then Robert the Bruce rebels again, and at 1307, they fight at the Battle of Loudon Hill. These sort of ongoing battles between the Scots and the English should go in favor of the English because they have the advantage of a larger army. But increasingly, the Scots are able to sort of evade these large-scale sort of pitched battles, and they're able to sort of buy some time. And this sort of refusal to acquiesce to the king's demands and to continue to proclaim their independence results really in this war of attrition until eventually Edward's attention is turned elsewhere. And that elsewhere is France. He has some trouble with Philip IV. Philip IV tries to claim parts of Gascony. Gascony is sort of located in southern France. Bordeaux is in Gascony, and Bordeaux is already sort of dominating the wine trade, and so it's a source of a lot of income for the English. So when Philip invades Gascony, Edward responds. He invades with a very large army. He raises a lot of money for this invasion. There's a few sort of military encounters, but at the end of the day, it's pretty inconclusive. He does not have the money, and he does not have the support in England to continue to press his cause in France. And so in 1303, he meets Philip IV. They agree to a truce. Philip leaves Gascony, but then Edward is forced to concede some other territories further in the south. And to sort of seal this truce, he marries his son, Edward II, his son and heir, to Isabel, who is a member of the royal family of France. And this is an illustration commemorating the meeting of these two kings and this sort of agreement and then the marriage that is to come. So by now, Edward is considerably older. This is really the end of any active campaigning on his part. What is the end result of all of this? For the most part, in spite of the resources invested, the years engaged, You really have to call it a draw with France. He doesn't really gain any additional territory in France. He gains control of some of the borderlands along Scotland, but he isn't able to force the kings of Scots to that sort of subordinate position that it looked like he would be successful in doing so a bit earlier in his career. He does force the sort of inadvertent growth of baronial power every time he wants to raise money to fight these wars, which is a lot. He has to call Parliament, and he has to request Parliament's permission to levy a tax. And so every time he does that, Parliament asks for more and more concessions, more and more authority to move from the king into the hands of Parliament. And so really one of the outcomes, sort of the non-military outcomes of Edward campaigns, is the growth of this sort of constitutional check on royal power in England. He does successfully conquer Wales. He builds sort of a ring of fortresses of these very large castles to maintain permanent control of that area. So Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, Criccieth, and Beaumaris. And these are all obviously very expensive endeavors, and so contribute to that need to raise revenue, which then in turn leads to these concessions to Parliament, which are going to sort of attempt to provide checks on the king's power moving forward. And apologies for the background noise that often shows up in some of these videos. This is the source of that noise. So this is my very active and sometimes uncontrollable dog.